Newsom is preparing to meet the Chinese president.
Off-duty pilot sitting in the cockpit jump seat allegedly tried to shut down the engines mid-flight with 83 people on board.
Another Chinese fighter jet harassing and flying dangerously close to a U.S. military plane.
Mike Johnson,
duly elected Speaker of the House of Representatives for the 118th Congress.
Active shooter in the town of Lewiston. All available units to Lewiston.
More than a dozen people were taken to the hospital today after a pileup in Louisiana involving about 100 cars. And officials say so-called super fog conditions likely played a role.
A massive pileup shutting down this interstate near New Orleans in both directions for hours. Pickup trucks stacked on top of each other. At least two 18-wheelers erupting in flames.
For miles, look at it. It's crazy.
This was the scene on Interstate 55. At least 21 people were taken to the hospital, including 3 in critical condition, according to hospital officials.
18 people were killed and 13 others injured.
In the small town of Lewiston, Maine.
In a matter of minutes at 2 different locations.
Shots ringing out just before 7 at just-in-time recreation during a youth bowling night. 12 minutes later, 4 miles away, Card opening fire at another restaurant, bar, and grill. The gunman's car located several hours later at a boat landing in Lisbon with a firearm inside. Card, an Army reservist, reportedly spending 2 weeks in July in a mental health facility after he reported hearing voices and threatened to shoot up a National Guard facility in Maine.
We heard about this fight that he had with his girlfriend and they broke up, and also these 4 men who, maybe these deaf guys that he hung around with, that he was hearing voices from them talking behind his back.
And law enforcement sources say a note found at the suspect's home is a suicide note addressed to Robert Card's son. The note reportedly does not provide any information on a motive for this mass shooting, but rather contains what sources describe as rantings, as well as some basic information like bank account details.
The note doesn't say, "You're never going to see me again. I'm going to kill myself, but first I'm going to settle these scores with, whatever madness was living in his mind." He said, "I don't think I'm going to survive this," is the language I keep seeing reported as in the letter. I don't have the letter. But isn't that a difference? That I don't think I'm going to survive this doesn't sound like a "I'm going to kill myself" note. It's "they'll probably kill me for what I'm going to do."
Army reservist Robert Card was found dead near a river 2 days after an intense manhunt across Maine.
Question still looming tonight is why? What led this person to go on this horrific rampage, and why did he choose those 2 places where he carried out this massacre?
It's just after 3 p.m. on June 23rd. Andrew Warrender, seen here wearing a blue t-shirt and jeans, enters Turnberry Towers. According to police, he had an uncle living at the complex, giving him easy access inside. After grabbing an AR-15 style rifle from inside his uncle's condo, Warrender made his way through the building, walking downstairs, through hallways, and even waiting for an elevator. Moments later, he opens fire in the lobby. As he walks toward the building's entrance, Warrender points his rifle at employees hiding behind the front desk. The video shows he was only able to fire off 1 shot before the rifle jammed. As Warrender worked to fix the malfunction, a Turnberry employee stepped into action and fired back, striking Warrender several times in his legs and stomach. The employee then approaches Warrender and holds him at gunpoint until police arrive.
Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up.
A grand jury indicted Warrender several months after he was released from the hospital.
Now, Warrender is set to stand trial in February. Meantime, he's been released from jail on a $25,000 bond.
An off-duty Alaska Airlines pilot is facing serious charges after an in-flight disturbance.
Crisis making an emergency landing ETA 4 minutes. The jump seat pilot, who is the extra pilot, they give a ride, tried to shut down the engines. Their emergency landing 4 minutes out.
Authorities say the on-duty cockpit and cabin crew subdued the man, handcuffing him to a seat in the cabin. The plane then diverting to Portland, police waiting on the tarmac, taking him into custody. Tonight, Joseph Emerson now facing 83 counts of attempted murder.
Facing 167 charges, including attempted murder, reckless endangerment, and endangering an aircraft.
Told investigators he had not slept in 40 hours, felt he was having a nervous breakdown, and mentioned the use of psychedelic mushrooms.
All flights have been grounded at Hobby Airport at this time. Investigators say 2 private jets clipped wings while moving on the runway. According to the FAA, one of those planes departed without permission. Luckily, nobody was hurt.
Congressman Jamal Bowman from New York is now charged in D.C. with 1 count of falsely pulling the fire alarm. He was seen on video pulling a fire alarm inside the Capitol as Democrats were trying to delay a key government funding vote. Bowman claims it was an accident,
which he pleaded guilty to yesterday.
Pay the fine. 3 months from now, it'll be dismissed, and I'll be able to just continue to serve my district.
You mean it'll be dismissed, like it'll be expunged from your record?
I believe so, yes.
That's the deal?
Yes, yeah.
With Capitol Police?
ACD, the DCAG.
Okay.
Yeah.
The claim that was made in terms of the explanation of his actions when we first heard about it was that he pulled the fire alarm and was so panicked that he started running away to try to get to the vote. And I don't see him running in this video. I mean, every explanation that we've heard about this has been utterly ridiculous. The first, that he thought the fire alarm would open the door, which has never been the case in basically any instance of modern history where there's been an emergency exit. Then there was the explanation that the sign that was on the door must have been confusing because it was labeled emergency exit, and apparently Jamal Bowman can't read. But then it turns out he actually took the sign off the door and never even tried to exit through the door that he was supposedly trying to open, just left the scene of the crime. Everything about this is absurd. I don't know what his reasoning was. Was he trying to delay the vote? I don't know. I think the only reason that I would err on the side of that not being his motivation is that he wanted the vote to go through because it ended up being on the side that he wanted it to go. But I just can't think of anything else reasonable or rational to explain what he was doing here.
Senator Chuck Grassley just announced that the Federal Bureau of Investigation has had 40 informants inside the Biden family for the last 15 years.
Over the weekend, it looked like finally there might be some real evidence. The House Oversight Committee on Friday released an image of a check, an actual check made out to Joe Biden from his brother James in the amount of $200,000. Chairman James Comer explained how James Biden received $600,000 in loans from a failing hospital operator called AmeriCorps. That company, in a bankruptcy filing, said they loaned James Biden the money, quote, based upon representations that his last name Biden could open doors and that he could obtain a large investment from the Middle East based on his political connections.
This family was involved in a very organized money laundering scheme, so it's very complicated to determine the source of a lot of these payments. But we've traced the $200,000 that Joe Biden received straight to the source, and it was AmeriCorps Health, a company that Jim Biden influenced peddled Joe Biden with. There's no question about it. There's court documents to prove that. Politico did a story several years about it. Jim Biden approached this company that was failing and said, my brother's contacts will allow me to help find you all the money you need in the Middle East.
Take a look at that check again. Look at that memo in the corner. Loan repayment. It was a loan. Joe Biden didn't scoop up the $200,000 in profit. He was getting paid back by his brother. Bank records reviewed by multiple outlets confirm that James Biden borrowed $200,000 from Joe 2 months earlier, and James was paying that money back. I've said all along, many of James and Hunter Biden's dealings look bad. It sure seems like they were trading on the Biden name. But that doesn't mean that Joe Biden was benefiting financially, and they know that they had not been able to show that.
In a letter, Senator Grassley writes, there appears to be an effort within the Justice Department and FBI to shut down investigative activity relating to the Biden family.
Now, let me back up just a little bit to explain what happened. During one of the breaks, the former president went into the hall room, as he usually does, and made some comments. And what he said in those comments was that he called the judge partisan, and he said the person sitting next to him is very partisan. Now, keep in mind, that gag order, when it was put in place by this judge, said that Trump could not speak ill about anyone on his staff. Well, everyone was brought back into the courtroom. There were a few sidebars, and the judge asked Trump who he was talking about. His lawyers responded, and Trump said that, or his lawyer said that Trump was talking about the judge, and the person sitting next to him, who was Michael Cohen, who was testifying at the time. Now, I need to just again back up a little bit to explain what it looks like in the courtroom. In this courtroom, the judge is in the middle. To his right is his court clerk. To his left is the person testifying. So the judge took it that Trump was talking about his court clerk, which would have been a violation of this gag order. There was a break in the courtroom, and then once lunch had come back, the judge made Trump take the stand and under oath say who he was talking about. Former president took the stand and again said that he was talking about the judge and Michael Cohen in his comments. Well, the moment Trump left the stand, the judge said this: as the trier of fact, I find that the witness is not credible, and he was referring to my law clerk. He fined the president $10,000. Now, again, the former president, $10,000. Again, this is the second time that he has received a fine based off of this gag order and violating it.
Louisiana's Mike Johnson,
duly elected Speaker of the House of Representatives for the 118th Congress,
now stepping into the speakership after serving 7 years in Congress. Solidly conservative and to some, controversial. Johnson voted into office to represent a ruby red district in 2016, rising through the Republican ranks, at one point chairing the Republican Study Committee before joining GOP leadership, although not at its highest levels until now.
360 more Ford employees will not be reporting to work today as the company continues to lay off people.
More than 6,800 UAW members have walked off the job at Stellantis' largest plant. This is where the best-selling Ram 1500 pickups are produced. 6,800 workers have now joined the stand-up strike, shutting down production.
This is being called a historic deal. In fact, one of the most lucrative in decades. It is 4 times more valuable than the last agreement that was made in 2019. So what does this mean? It means that Ford workers, they will no longer be walking the picket line this morning. They will be back at work. So this tentative deal that was made some 40 days into the strike does include a 25% wage increase through 2028. Top wages will go from $32 an hour to $40. Starting wages will also see a significant jump, up 68% to $28 an hour. The agreement also provides improvements for retirees as well as pensions and 401k benefits. So all of this, of course, means that workers at the Kentucky truck plant, a big moneymaker for Ford Chicago Assembly, as well as the Ford Michigan Assembly, they are back at work.
You said, let's see. I'm curious what the membership thinks of it. Although, I mean, to get cost of living adjustments back when they were suspended in 2009, that's pretty big in itself because it's not frozen in time. You get the COLA adjustment, and that is really one of the reasons why they have not just suffered like lack of wage inflation, they actually suffered deflation over the last decade. So
China treated Gavin Newsom, governor of California, like the president he wants to be.
First U.S. governor to visit China since 2019.
What's your biggest takeaway from today's meeting with President Xi?
Well, I thought we accelerated our progress on climate in meaningful and substantive ways.
Newsom didn't know where, when, or even if this meeting would happen until moments before.
I could see why he would welcome Gavin Newsom. There's only 4 other leaders in the world that have a bigger economy than Gavin Newsom.
What is California, Governor, getting out of this meeting, getting out of this trip?
More tourism, I hope. More two-way trade, I hope. More economic development, more economic growth, more prosperity, more peace, more collaboration.
Newsom says after this meeting, more collaboration will be coming from Beijing to combat fentanyl abuse.
And I think that China is going to be one of our major trading partners, whether we like it or not, for the foreseeable future. And a lot of people who are hawkish on China, tweet that from a cell phone made in China.
U.S. Ambassador to China, Robert Burns, with Newsom for every meeting. Clear sign of support from the Biden administration.
We are fully supporter of the governor's trip. I thought this was a very positive, consequential day for the United States.
Taiwan's military spotted 35 Chinese warplanes and 15 Navy ships around the country in the last 24 hours. China regularly conducts exercises near Taiwan as a way to test the country's defenses. 23 of those planes entered Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. Now, this zone does not belong to Taiwan, but it is used by the military here for defensive purposes. 16 fighter jets, 3 recon planes, and a helicopter entered the zone. 2 drones were also spotted in the ADIZ, with one circling the main island of Taiwan. This comes one day after Taiwan's military reported that one of China's aircraft carriers, the Shandong, had passed through the Bashi Channel near the Philippines on its way to the Western Pacific. Taiwan's military says it has deployed missile defense systems and is monitoring the situation.
One of the considerations that has to be made about this time of year specifically and PLA activities is that this is good weather. So they have to practice when the weather is good, or else they're not going to be able to practice, and they need the practice. But as we get closer to January, I mean, weather notwithstanding, I think, Beijing has learned the hard way in the past that attempting to intimidate Taiwanese voters really doesn't go their way.
The U.S. military has released video of yet another Chinese fighter jet harassing and flying dangerously close to a U.S. military plane. Officials say this happened Tuesday over the South China Sea. The Chinese jet coming within 10 feet of the American B-52.
Jet flew with uncontrolled excessive speed and flew below, in front of, and within 3 meters of the B-52 bomber.
Hundreds of demonstrators from a Jewish activist group making their way into Grand Central Terminal's main concourse and staging a sit-in during rush hour. The group Jewish Voice for Peace demanding a ceasefire in Gaza on a day Israeli military forces increased incursions.
Right now, you are hearing thousands of Jewish New Yorkers who are raising our voices, so clear that our safety can never come at the expense of another community's safety.
Members of the group somehow getting on top of a ledge next to the departure sign as NYPD officers from emergency services tried to get them down. The scene reminiscent of a protest back in 1991 when ACT UP took similar actions inside the terminal.
We recognize this war for what it is. It's not about protecting Jews. It's not about Jewish safety.
The sit-in lasting about an hour before police started making arrests. Authorities say about 100 people were taken into custody.
At least 24 U.S. troops have been injured in Iraq and Syria in just the past week alone. The Pentagon pinning it on Iranian proxy groups, though right now at this hour, there's no direct evidence that Iran actually ordered those attacks to take place. The White House says it is preparing to evacuate Americans from the Middle East if the Israel-Hamas war spills into a broader regional conflict.
The United States has just struck 2 Iranian-linked locations in eastern Syria. That, U.S. says, is in retaliation for attacks against U.S. personnel.
It gives the United States military and the Biden administration an excuse to really escalate conflict in the region, which I think genuinely, based on their actions, is what this administration wants, but is very clearly what the American people do not want.
Overnight, Israel carried out its biggest airstrikes to date in its war against Hamas terrorists, and troops also conducted more ground raids. The army says its troops are still in the field. Communications in Gaza have been knocked out entirely.
Apparently, Hamas had offered to return 2 Israeli hostages. Of course, they should return all hostages. These are, by and large, innocent civilians. It is an atrocity that they're being held right now captive against their will. But Israel decided that they would not accept those 2 hostages back from Hamas, saying they will not address what is considered to be mendacious propaganda by the group. So their view, this is hard for me to understand, frankly, is that they didn't want to give Hamas some sort of a PR victory by making it appear like they were open to negotiations in good faith by accepting these 2 hostages.
Right now, these U.S. warships are gathering in the region. There's the second aircraft carrier group set to arrive really any day. And the mission here for the destroyers and cruisers and jets that you see here for now is to bring this kind of show of force to scare off anybody trying to take advantage of the chaos between Israel and Hamas.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people.
Not actually mentioning how long Hamas has been ruling in the Palestinian state in Gaza, despite clarifying again that Hamas's attacks are not justified, as you heard him say there. Israel's ambassador to the UN calling for Guterres' resignation and will refuse visas to UN officials. Israel's foreign minister also announcing he will no longer meet with the UN chief.
Netanyahu is petrified of the hostages' families. It could impact his judgment. This is actually insane what he has done here. So first he gave a statement to the nation on Saturday evening. This was like a week ago. He claimed to have spoken to those who lost their loved ones or whose fate is unknown. No actual family member of a hostage was identified as having spoken to him. Okay, so that's that. The next day, he finally meets with a group of representatives from the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, when suddenly a man who claimed to also be a relative of a hostage entered the meeting, starting praising the prime minister, saying he trusted any decision that he makes. Well, it emerged after that that dude is a far-right activist with ties to members of the Netanyahu family, zero known ties to hostages. The man's wife, meanwhile, had organized a counter-protest outside the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv, opposite the family's vigil. Some of the protesters screamed abuse.
My warning to the Ayatollah was that if they continue to move against those troops, we will respond, and he should be prepared. It has nothing to do with Israel.
We know Iran continues to support Hamas and Hezbollah. And we know that Iran is closely monitoring these events, and in some cases actively facilitating these attacks and spurring on others who may want to exploit the conflict for their own good or for that of Iran. We know Iran's goal is to maintain some level of deniability here, but we're not going to allow them to do that. We also are not going to allow any threat to our interest in the region to go unchallenged. We demonstrated last week that we have and will use the military capables available to us to protect and defend those interests. And those capabilities are getting bigger and better every day.
And I think that most Americans, when they hear Janet Yellen say we can afford 2 wars, they consider human lives, not just whether or not the Treasury can issue the American dollars.
We should mention we currently cannot contact our sources in Gaza anymore.
Governments could raise up to $250 billion annually if they impose a global tax on billionaires. That's according to the latest report from independent research group, the EU Tax Observatory. It says that billionaires currently pay less personal tax than taxpayers of more modest means because they can park their wealth in shell companies as a way to avoid income tax. They claim that a billionaire tax could raise financing for the energy transition and pay off debt racked up during the pandemic.
Former Vice President Mike Pence has just suspended his campaign for president.